GSPIA's lecture series. I'm Kathy Beagle, director of the forum, and it's my particular pleasure to introduce our discussion today and our speaker, whom many of you know as an advocate for community change and a tireless champion for children in Detroit and in the policy chambers well beyond the Motor City. We've entitled our series, The Future of Philanthropy in Uncertain Times. And that catchphrase has proven to be both troubling and timeless, especially now as so many cities wrestle with growing inequities, with pressure on public resources, and widening gaps in the sense of community that binds us to one another. These complexities are compounded in industry-connected cities like our own and in Detroit, where community change is entwined with economic recovery and post-industrial transformation. So given that title and the dissonance of our times, it seemed appropriate to examine philanthropy within this dynamic mix and to see its work within cities seeking greater equity and equilibrium for all. By looking at collaborations, creative networks, and collective will focused on children, we hope to produce a different soundtrack in this forum, one focused on leadership opportunity rather than rancor alone. This morning, for the second time in our 8-year series, we look to Detroit to reflect on how philanthropy is rethinking its social capital and the possibilities for positive change for its youngest constituents. In cities like our own and in Detroit, the epicenter of post-industrial foment, philanthropy is enlisting new partners and expanding its unique resources to help counteract some of these more intractable challenges. With the help of many different allies, many of them in this room, practitioners of philanthropy are morphing from traditional grant makers to community change makers. Nowhere is this more evident than in the work underway to ensure that all children have the opportunity to thrive in communities that place them at the center of post-recovery policies and community empowerment strategies. And so to explore these dynamics of an expanded brand of philanthropic leadership, we've invited Tonya Allen, President and CEO of the Skillman Foundation in Detroit. Since 2004, when she came to Skillman, Tonya has led the charge for educational reform in her hometown. She has pushed for policies that put children first in Detroit, fashioning Skillman's $100 million 10-year Good Neighborhoods program, which strives to boost high school graduation, create safe routes to school, and empower youth. Working with other community leaders, Tonya has advanced the largest coalition ever assembled to fix Detroit's schools. And in the process, she has thought deeply about the hands-on role that local foundations can play in keeping children's issues first and center in the civic agenda of recovering cities. So today, Tonya will share her reflections about this mandate for a new form of philanthropic capital focused on connective leadership and the long-term view of community change. Then we'll turn to 3 respondents to provide brief comments and a local perspective on work that's kindred in so many ways here in Pittsburgh. Joining us from the Grable Foundation is Greg Baer, architect of the Remake Learning Network and champion of Kidsburg, an effort to put children's issues top of mind in our region. And I saw a number of smiles here. Even the word Kidsburg makes you break out in happiness. At Grable, Greg has worked to advance school reform, early childhood education, out of school time, and informal learning. Diana Bucco, executive director of the Buell Foundation, will draw upon her experiences in place-based community revitalization strategies and Buell's One Northside agenda as the basis of her remarks. Like Greg, Diana has deep connections to the field. She led the Forbes Fund capacity building and public policy efforts and shares a passion for mentoring and community building from her days as founding executive director of the Coro Center for Leadership. John Wallace, chair of the Homewood Children's Village Board and an active advocate for children in Homewood and the broader Pittsburgh community, will offer his thoughts about Tonya's leadership dimensions. Dr. Wallace is professor of social work at the University of Pittsburgh and principal investigator at the University Center on Race and Social Problems. A frequent author, his work on community revitalization in lower income communities provides an influential voice on the intersection of community health, educational improvement, parental support, and neighborhood empowerment. How could we want for a richer dialogue this morning? And now, it's my great pleasure to bring to the podium Tonya Allen, president of the Spelling.
Thank you so much, Kathy. So it's really good to see everyone. And I'm also very proud of each of you for waking up this early and actually making it here on time. So if I were in Detroit, I would probably be just walking through the door. So thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. I want to talk to you about all of the things that Kathy said. But mostly what I'm hoping is that I can spur a conversation in your community about how your community can leapfrog all of the other recovering cities in this country. Because that's the question that I am often posing for myself is how do we learn from what other people are doing in this country or even in cities across the world. And I am often questioning, what can we learn? How do we not make the same mistakes that other places made? How do we build off of the platform of knowledge and wisdom in a way that helps advance the issues of children in our community in a quicker, more deeper way? So let me get started. And how are the children? This is the traditional greeting from the Maasai tribe in Africa, where they acknowledge that the highest value is always placed on the well-being of children. The desired response that everybody in that tribe would like to say is that all of the children are well. Meaning, of course, that there is peace and prosperity for all, that the priority of protecting children, the powerless, and all of the things that we need to do as a community are in place. So I often say that you can tell the soul of a city by how it treats its children. And my speech today is really about talking to you about how philanthropy can curate the optimal conditions in which cities can respond. All the children are well. Okay. So you all know that I lead the Skillman Foundation, which is a children's foundation in Detroit. In the last 12 years or so, we have been in a big transformational process as an institution where we've essentially gone from the ivory tower to the community. And so we were a very traditional foundation. Actually, we were situated in the tallest building, literally, in the city of Detroit. And we were a pretty effective grant maker, but mostly a responsive grant maker. We set out a set of ideas that we thought were important ideas. We asked people to respond to those ideas, and we were able to attract many organizations who were doing fantastic work, and we invested in them. The shift came when we decided that what we needed to do was to not just fund great ideas, that we actually needed to fund changing the conditions for children in the places where they live. And so that put us on this journey to invest deeply in 6 neighborhoods in Detroit. Now, when I say 6 neighborhoods, they're not really neighborhoods, let me be clear. They're more like geographic sub-communities. Because in these 6 neighborhoods is a third of the child population in the city of Detroit. So it's about almost 40,000 children who live in these places. And so over the course of our work as an institution, we have worked deeply and embedded with community. We have prioritized the voices of residents. We have prioritized the voices of community agencies. We have prioritized the voices of everyone who has an integral part in the lives of children to hear, to understand, and help co-design solutions that we believe will be effective for children. We finished that work. After, we said 10 years, but anybody who's ever been in place-based work, you can never leave in 10 years, so it's been almost 12. And so one might say, well, what did you accomplish? What were some of the things that you were able to achieve? And I want to tell you briefly that and then set up what I want to talk to you about. What we were able to accomplish was that in these neighborhoods, graduation rates trailed the city's average by 10%. They now lead the city average by about 5%. We've seen an increase of 20% growth in these areas. Interesting enough, for boys of color, we've seen graduation rates go up 30% for them. We also have seen crime decrease in these neighborhoods by as much as 40 and 50%, violent crime in these communities in which children live. Now, I have to admit that these places are still pretty unsafe places, even though we've seen the crime decrease. We also were able to see young people get into jobs. We went from having and helping fund maybe about 400 jobs for young people. We're now at 8,200 jobs that kids are participating in. We've also seen an increase in the number of young people who have gone on to college. So we've seen numbers that look like 10% that were applying for post-secondary, and it's now 70% that it's applying to post-secondary after school, after they finish high school. But what we don't fully yet know is whether or not they are actually matriculating fully, and we're still looking at that. But what we are finding is that we invested deeply in leaders, and these leaders who are young people have gone on to college and they've come back to these communities. And I don't know about you and what has happened in Pittsburgh, but in Detroit, the goal was, success was, you go away from Detroit and you leave Detroit, and that constituted success. What we have been able to do is redefine in our communities that if you come back to Detroit, you go off, you get an education, you come back to Detroit and you help solve and fix the problems of Detroit, that now is the new definition of success. So we have lots of young people who are deeply engaged in leadership. And I think that their engagement is extraordinarily important at this particular time. So many of you have heard the stories about Detroit, you've heard the stories about our decline, and you hear the stories about our shaky recovery. And I describe it as shaky because it's shaky. There are some places where we see real recovery, and then there are places where we do not really fully see that recovery. And so my goal is, as an institution, is to make sure that as we are building a recovery in our city, that it is an inclusive recovery, and that inclusive recovery makes a generational play for children. So I often use this example of cities like Detroit. So if you go back 40 years and you look at places like San Francisco, Seattle, Boston, New York City, each of them were on the brink of bankruptcy. Every single one of those cities were. And now they come back, and they are now the hotbeds of our nation's economy. And I believe that possibility is true for Detroit just like it is true for Pittsburgh. But what I say the challenge for us as a community and the challenge for us as a country is to not recover in the same way that those cities have recovered, where the poor are now being isolated to the suburbs, that they can no longer live in the city, that they cannot participate in the recovery. They cannot participate in the prosperity of those places. And so as I think about the next generation of the Skillman Foundation's work, that's the work that I think is going to be most important and most crucial, is how do we make sure that we have an inclusive recovery that really benefits all. Now, let me tell you what I believe we have to do to actually make that happen and come to fruition. And I want to also recognize I don't have any answers. Like, I can bring you to Detroit and I can tell you some amazing stories about things that are working, but as a whole, they haven't. But what I do think that I have is a set of a combination of observations, approaches, lessons, considerations, and challenges that I think allow us to think about how our practice might be different and how our practice could be more influential and more informative. So philanthropic organizations, our influence comes from our capital. We know this. We have grants budgets, we have corpuses, we have very influential boards, and we also have human capital. We have staff people who are usually coming from the field, and they have had great success in that field, and we have intellectual capital. Meaning that we have been able to gather the best information from the people that we're supporting on the ground as they push up what they're learning and what they know. And then we have every university, every think tank in the country sending us every hard copy document they possibly can. So we have this ability to bring knowledge and intelligence together, and it sits within our institutions. Now the challenge is that as institutions, we only choose to really use one or two of those capitals. And we only privilege one or two of those capitals. So we spend a ton of time thinking about our capital and our grant capital. And I'm sure you go through a very rigorous process to decide how you're going to give away $20,000. But you're not using the same amount of energy and the same discipline thinking about how you will use your voice, how you will use your privilege as an elite institution to be able to pull the voices of your board members to weigh in on an issue, which could quite honestly be quite more powerful than the $20,000, or in some cases $200,000 that you would give to an organization. And so what I want to do is spend a little bit of time talking about what does it mean to be a change-making organization, and what does it require for us to do differently as leaders in these institutions. The first thing I want to talk about, quite honestly, is leadership. Pittsburgh is no stranger to leadership, philanthropic leadership. You've stood up on really important and contentious issues. And I think that is extraordinarily important for you to use your philanthropic voice on these issues. But I would say that as we use our voice around leadership, that I think we have to say a few things that I think are important. One is we have to constantly ask ourselves, are we courageous enough to make unpopular decisions? Are we courageous enough to communicate those unpopular decisions? Are we courageous enough to use our influence? And are we courageous enough to not confuse our influence? Now, you're probably, what does that mean? To not confuse our influence. A lot of times what we see in philanthropy, or at least what I see in philanthropy, is that we privilege because we're privileged institutions, and we can make a statement that doesn't necessarily have a political lens on it. What we often try to do is we actually kind of honor our voice. We give our voice privilege over other people's voice, and our voice will herald and sing in different ways. But our voice is not a democratic voice. Nor is it a moral voice, even though we often will claim that. And I think it is important as we step in this role of change making that we know how to use our voice, and that we use it importantly and wisely, but we don't confuse it with being a democratic institution or that it's a moral voice for the community. Our voice has importance, but it is not the most important voice. Our voices cannot replace government, nor can it replace democracy. Our voices actually have to be the voices that heralds and brings together lots of people, and that we are the people who will talk to other people that most people will not talk to. I often hear philanthropy talk about a couple of things. One thing that they often say is we talk to everyone. Well, actually you don't. Most people talk to people who are very much like them. We talk to people who may have a slightly different idea, but we talk to people who really are saying the same things that we're saying. I did this often in our work at the Skillman Foundation. When we first started in education reform, I would bring all of the people together that I thought were important voices in this, and all of the people who would be yelling outside the school board meetings. I never talked to them because they were crazy. That's the way I described them. I actually described them not as crazy, I could describe them as cave people, citizens against virtually everything. And I was like, what do I have in common with these people? And basically they're committed to the status quo, they're committed to just arguing. And it wasn't until I opened up my ears and began to talk to these people that I understood and I didn't say I agreed, but I began to understand what their perspective was, which gave me intelligence about how I could craft my response in a different way, or how they could hear themselves in the solutions that we were setting forth. And in some cases, we actually involved them and included them. And I often talk about this question of inclusion and whether foundations are really facilitating that. Most of the time you see foundations who are fighting to get to the table themselves instead of actually trying to work on setting a table where people not only can come to that table, but they also can help control what is going to be served at the table. And I often describe that when we're setting tables and we're actually inviting people and we give them a fold-up chair, that's really not inclusion. But that's what we often do. So setting the table is about bringing people permanently to a civic table where they can have voice and that they can have influence, not on the issues that we name, but on the issues that we collectively name together. I often think about diversity as counting the people. Inclusion is about making sure that the people count, that their voices and their ideas count. And I think that that is going to be the new role that philanthropy is going to have to play, especially when you think about the political context which we are in our country right now, where we have lost civility, where we cannot talk to each other. Kathy talked about one of the efforts that I worked on, which was Coalition for the Future of Detroit School Children. And this was a broad-based effort where we pulled together every kind of person you possibly could pull together and bring them around the table. So we brought business, we brought people who were, we brought parents. I often described it as we brought people who could buy a parent a car and a parent that could not afford to bus money to be able to get to the meeting. We brought together teachers, we brought together charters, traditional public, we brought together principals, we brought together elected officials, we brought together faith leaders, we brought together this broad, eclectic group of people, and it also included some of the cave people. And what we tried to do was to make this declaration as a community that we were going to stop fighting each other, and that we were going to fight for children. And that was it. So the rule was, everybody leave your weapons at the door. Like, let's come in, let's start with a shared set of values, let's get a shared aspiration, and then we can create a shared plan of work. And that plan of work had to be practical. And so one of the things that we found in pulling this work together was that instead of guiding people through the work and hiring people to do the work, and as a part of a coalition, which what you generally see in coalitions is you pull everybody together and then you hire somebody to execute the coalition's work, and then usually what happens is that that work never really looks the way that the coalition really imagined it to look. So instead of doing that, we tried to avoid it completely. And what we attempted to do was to get different people to play an active role in the work immediately. And this created such buy-in in such important ways. And what that buy-in did was allow us to get to what I call the 70-20-10 framework. And this is important to me because this is about inclusion, and it's about how we move forward when we're in contentious environments and places. And so I have this theory, I don't know if it's true, but it's worked for me, is that most people, if you are working on any issue, you can agree on 70% of whatever the issue is. You can agree on 70% of the set of solutions. And that if you could figure out and talk about what that 70% is, you will agree and you will work together. And then there's another 20% that you just disagree on. And that in most cases, you can work your way up to that 20% by negotiating. And then there's the last 10% where you will never agree. You just won't ever agree. You just have different sets of values, you have a different world outlook, you have a different worldview, and you will not agree on those things. Well, most of us, when we start trying to work together, we try to start at 10%, and we never move beyond that 10%. And what I've tried to do in this work that we're going forward in Detroit is to leave the 10% alone, and let's start at figuring out what 70% is, and let's try and work our way up to 90 instead of stopping at 10. And that really requires that we're listening to everyone, that we're hearing everyone, that we're engaging them. It also means that I think as philanthropic organizations that we as leaders have to bring our authentic selves. We have to be fearless. We have to lead beyond our shortcomings, and we have to lead sometimes from the middle and sometimes from the back. I know it's so much easier to lead from the front, but leading from the middle and leading from the back, in my opinion, is really about making sure that we are talking to people, hearing people, connecting people, and using what I would call connective and contextual intelligence, which I'm going to talk about for a second. But before I do so, leading with integrity is so crucial, and leading with authenticity. I often describe, I don't know if any of you figured this out, I'm a black woman from Detroit. And I often say, if I lead like a white man from the suburbs of Michigan, then I'm doing it all wrong. What's the use of having me? I have to lead with my authentic experience. And that authentic experience ought to create some new and different dynamics because diversity and inclusion is not just about representativeness. It's actually about the inclusion of new ideas and new approaches. And so when I talk about this often, and I'm in these meetings and I'm leading the meetings, and I start quoting Francis Page. Does anybody know who the great philosopher Francis Page is? Oh, you do good. This is my grandmother. I quote her because her philosophy was probably the most influential thing on my leadership. And I will say to people, none of us is smarter than all of us. And they believe me. And I say, let's go as far as we can see, and then we'll see how far we can go. And then my grandmother's favorite quote, let's get to work. I say that, and I say it with urgency, and I say it with passion, because my experience as an African-American woman that grew up in Detroit is that I've seen the decline of that community. And I know the carnage that we have left in our wake by doing nothing, or by using the same tools and the same approaches that we've had before. And so to me, it is extraordinarily important that as we become change makers as institutions, whatever your experience is. So some of us have grown up on farms, some of us have grown up in the Depression era, some of us are millennials and grown up with, I'm gonna say something negative, where, everybody is patting you on the back. But you also have grown up as a digital native, right? Like in all of those different things, if we bring our full and true selves to the work, it actually creates a different dynamic of change, and you also create a space where other people can also bring their full and authentic selves. And in that authenticity, I believe that's when we begin to see each other's humanity. And we may underestimate that, But I actually think that being able to see each other's humanity is our biggest challenge in most places. Is because we are limited so much that we're not seeing and talking to other people. We don't know what other people are thinking. I shared an example last night where I was talking, when I was pulling this coalition together, there were two examples that were striking to me about how we didn't see each other's humanity. One was I had a Latina woman who lived in the southwest part of Detroit, and we were talking after a few meetings. We're going through talking about issues in Detroit schools, and she was sitting across a group of pretty conservative Republican business leaders in our region. And she said to me, and then she said to the group, I never knew that Republicans cared about children. And I was like, that made no sense to me. Like, I could not understand it. But it does make a lot of sense to me after you really think about it. Is that we have isolated ourselves so much that we have created a narrative that reinforces, that is reinforcing itself, that in a lot of ways we have not opened ourselves up to different stories or different narratives. The second is I was talking with a colleague, one of these business guys who didn't care about children, quote unquote. I asked him to go on a bus tour. Not a bus tour, to take a family to school, to go with a family as they were transporting to school. So he woke up really early, got on the bus with this family, walked a quarter of a mile, 3/4 of a mile to the bus stop, waited 20 or 30 minutes for the bus to show, got on that bus, drove about another, 2 miles, got off the bus, waited on another bus for another 20 or 30 minutes, got on the bus, then got off the bus in about 4 or 5, not even that long, about maybe a mile and a half. And then he walked half a mile, and then he doubled back, and then walked another mile to drop off 2 children. It was basically a 4-mile ride from the location of where the mom lived and where the kids went to school. But it took her an hour and a half. And he asked her all of these questions. She gave him a ton of information about why she had to make these choices, which were all logical and practical for her and for her children. And then after he finished it, he said, I wish I could have just called an Uber because it was cold outside. And he said, but ultimately what I found from this was that this mother is the ultimate tiger mom. That what we don't really recognize is that her humanity and the experience she has to do, the things that she had to do to get there, created a different level of his understanding of humanity than he would ever do if he didn't have that set of experiences. And I think as we think about this, we have to start beginning to change the narrative about what is happening in communities and what children are facing. Children are resilient. I just read an interesting article about African American males in Detroit and those who succeeded, how they graduated from high school. As I was reading this research from a researcher, and I'm looking at it, and he had deep interviews with 20 young men who had all graduated, gone on to college, and looked at all of the struggles of them. Each of those young men have been robbed at gunpoint. Every single one of them. It was just a part of their general narrative. I am frightened by that. I'm frightened that when we start talking about graduation rates, or we talk about the challenges that young men face in our cities, in places like Detroit and in places like Pittsburgh, we talk about them as challenges. We don't talk about their resiliency and what they're facing every day.